Lovely. That's great. That's our recording kicked off. My name is Roisin Guilfoyl, and I am the Research Support Librarian here at TU Dublin. Together with my colleague, our Open Scholarship Librarian, Aisling, we're going to host this 1.5 hour session on publishing. So I'm going to look at initially things that you should really think about or that should be on your agenda when you are considering publishing. And Aisling is going to speak very specifically about the fundamental pillar of academic publishing that is open and open access. So there will be a handover in between the two sessions and plenty of opportunities for questions along the way. If anybody wants to ask a question, they can pop it in the chat, and maybe Aisling will keep an eye on that for me, and I will do the same then on the other side. So without further ado, we'll get going. So hopefully this is really just getting you to start thinking about what you want to achieve through your publishing, what your options are for publishing, in other words, how you can go about it, the different types of way that you can publish, the peer review process, because that is often foremost in our minds when we are publishing within academia. How you go about selecting a publication, that can actually be quite tricky, especially if you're new to publishing. Also, dealing with reviews from peer review, that can be quite a tricky thing for people to deal with. I'm also going to mention predatory publishing because in today's world, we cannot speak about publishing without making sure that you are aware of the occasionally questionable publishing practices of some publishers. And then some tips on how to avoid falling into the clutches, as it were, of a predatory publisher. In other words, how to spot them if you can. So things you should think about when you're getting published. There are quite a lot of things. The first thing that you need to be mindful of are the stipulations of your funders. In other words, the rules around publishing that may come with a grant for research. So certain organizations will stipulate that you must make your material open access, that it cannot be published in certain types of journals, for example, a hybrid journal, which Aisling will explain the differences in hybrid journals and regular journals, as it were, or open access journals. And of course, your institutional policy. So that's very important for most of us working in European universities because we are open. We are open institutions, we support open research, and therefore open access is a requirement that you have. So wherever you're publishing and whatever you want to do, you must be prepared to make sure that it will be open to all without payment of a fee. The other thing you might think about, really, if we think about down here, we think about your audience. So who do you want to reach in terms of with your information from your publication? So the first real thing there is if it's going to be peer review or not. That might be a requirement, that might be something that you want to achieve, or perhaps that's not particularly important, but they're going to indicate your audience. So a scholarly publication will nearly always have some level of peer review. Okay, so that will be there. Practitioner research is research that you share among people doing the same job as you in the same area. You might be sharing practice, you might be sharing knowledge, you could be sharing a case study, but generally it's aimed at not necessarily the wider research academic community, very much applied practitioners, people working in your own area, and may or may not be peer reviewed. And then, of course, you could be aiming for a popular publication. So we'll have a look what I mean by that. But popular means outside of academia. So appealing to the general public, making your information aware in a user-friendly way to the wider general public. Also, the type of paper. Sometimes we have decided in our heads that we are going to write a literature review or a case study. If you have a particular publication in mind, you need to make sure that they accept those kind of publications, particularly around case studies. Not every journal will accept a case study, so do keep that in mind. Think about your topic. So, and think about the topic of the journal. If it's a general academic journal, you'll have a wider audience, but if your topic is particularly specialist, it means that maybe it won't get as much notice from the people that you want to see it. So you might opt to choose for a very specialist journal that specializes in your particular area. And although it may have a smaller audience, it will have more impact on practice and knowledge within that area. So do look at the topics that are covered within the journal. Think about the time frame that you have, remembering that some of the best journals, indeed many academic journals, will have a long lead in time to get published. So if it has peer review, that is going to take some time. And it could be that it's quite a popular journal and that there is a queue, if you will, of material trying to get published. So all in all, the process could take anything from 8, 10, 12 months, even longer, depending on the journal that you want to get in. So just factor that in. If time is on your mind, you need to look on the journal and see what the guidelines are in terms of getting published, from submission, acceptance to publication. And the reputation, your reputation, and of course the reputation of the journal. So that's around predatory publishing, or people who have not maybe best practice in terms of publication. So you might want to consider that as well. And finally, create a short list of journals that you might be interested in. Can you do that? Even if it's just titles that you like, areas, if they're broader, as I said, broader academic journals or quite specialist material, create a shortlist of where you would like to publish. That could be based on what you read yourself already. So getting published, as I said, we have scholarly, peer-reviewed, aimed at the general academic researcher community. We have practitioner-based research, and we have popular material. So I've included Scientific American up there because a lot of people get confused about that and think that it's actually a scholarly publication, but it's not. Some of the differences are scholarly publications are written by experts, academics and researchers, but the likes of Scientific American will be written by journalists. They're not necessarily experts. They might be experts, journalists, but they will not be scholars. So, and researchers. So we'll have a little closer look at that. There is another place to get published. Normally at this point I would ask the room, but I can't see, and I've gone ahead there, I've skipped ahead, that we have another option. And this is very important if you are trying to get your research out there really, really quickly. We have preprints. So we have scholarly, practitioner, popular, and we have preprints. They're not new. Preprints, the original preprints was, if you have a look here, the archive in 1991, created by Cornell University. And since then, they have been added to hugely, often specializing in subject areas. Many of you will be familiar with SSRN, which would be based in the social sciences. So you can see there for every subject, there will be a preprint server that will be willing to take your paper. So if time is an issue and you really want to get your material out there, you can go for a preprint. Okay, now a preprint should not be confused with the open access copy that you would have in an institutional repository. The preprint is pre-submission and pre-peer review, whereas your author-accepted manuscript goes on your institutional repository, that is post-peer review. So just worth mentioning that. So just to go through the types of publications and what they mean, scholarly publications will generally present research findings written by experts. Usually their credentials, in other words, their degrees and affiliation, university or organization affiliations, are provided at the head of the article. So you will know who they are, how they've qualified, what their qualifications are, and who they work for. It's aimed very much at other researchers or experts. So there'll be a lot of use of technical language or jargon because it's speaking to a community that already understands that language. So they don't need to explain or use simplified language. usually presented in a common format. So you'll have a similar structure across the board. You'll have an introduction or light descriptive literature review. You'll have a methodology, methods, data collection, discussion and conclusions. They're generally all the same and usually quite often peer reviewed. Okay, so very, very structured. You will know exactly what you're getting if you're going down this road. Practitioner research. It's not less, it's different, by the way. In terms of evidence, yes, there is an order of evidence, and scholarly is usually the peak of that because it's peer reviewed. But practitioner research is not any less, it's just different. It has a different purpose. So it identifies trends and practices, and it is written by practitioners or specialist journalists. So, for example, I'm not a researcher per se, I'm not an academic, but librarians do publish to share practice with other librarians. In fact, it's quite an important part of being a librarian. It's aimed at fellow professionals or practitioners within a specific field, so often sharing practice and insights. Mixture of formats. You might have a reflective piece, you might have a case study. So there would be a lot more different formats would be acceptable in practitioner research. They're not always referenced, but usually they are. Usually there would be reference to existing literature. And while not always peer reviewed, they will be edited and are open to rebuttal and comment from other practitioners who publish within the journal. The popular ones are there to entertain and inform the general population. So a lot of us hearing about, say, climate change or the climate emergency might have read about that initially in publications like Scientific American. So basically, it is very important for the public to be able to understand, make decisions, be in the debate on something that is so important to us. So that's where these popular type of publications are hugely important. And this can also include newspapers, and you would often see academics indeed writing for newspapers, again, simplifying language, making it accessible to people who aren't experts. So aimed very much at general public, simplifying language, generalizing major concepts to make sure that we can, the general public or non-experts, find it accessible. They tend to be quite glossy publications. There's a lot of money because they have they're not relying on subscriptions per se. There's a wider audience, more people buy them. It's more likely that the general public will have subscriptions to them, so they can afford to put a lot of money into paying their journalists, paying their graphic artists or whatever. They're usually quite glossy, not peer reviewed, generally not referenced, but again, open to criticism and indeed retraction, which is also hugely important in this day and age. And finally, our preprints, very important. First past the post with research. So if you are trying to put a marker out there and get research out very quickly, you can use a preprint server. We saw them hugely used during COVID. Now, that had pluses and minuses in that people were anxious to get research out there, added to the growing research on something that was so new and so catastrophic for so many people. Unfortunately, then things go out there and are retracted, but not everybody sees the retraction, and we have preprints leaking into the popular sphere, and we get fake news, or we get people taking small studies. So there are pluses and minuses, but generally the pluses outweigh the minuses when it comes to preprint. Of course, they're the ultimate open science, and that's usually important. The author has say when something is made available, so you're not waiting in a line, you're not waiting for peer review or editorial, although you should. There will be some editorial controls with a preprint, but you have more control about when it's made available. It's increasing visibility because it's free to access. And most preprint platforms allow some form of feedback. Again, another difference to an institutional repository where that wouldn't be available to you. And I've put in democracy in there, and that's hugely important. If I were to tell you that slightly over 50% of material that's on a preprint server doesn't get published, okay? So you might think that's very alarming. And obviously there's material that was first principles or first results from research studies, and they're not correct or flawed or were disproved, and they don't get published. But the important thing about preprint is that we have our colleagues and fellow researchers who are publishing research in the global south. And while we have increased access to information for colleagues in the global south, publishing is still very expensive and may not always be a way to print. So preprint servers allow a very important and significant way of those researchers getting their research out into the wider world. So there is a democratizing element to preprints. So all of those are very, very important. And if there are any questions, as I said, please pop them in the chat. Aisling will be there keeping an eye, and we can address those. Just a little bit about preprints in case you're tempted to. Yes.
So
go ahead.
Interruption. We have Salar raised his hand. So probably, or maybe we can leave the questions after the presentations, or if you want now. It depends.
Well, I'll try and answer the question now, if you like, just as a break, so people don't have to hear my voice. It's good to hear another voice every so often. So please do go ahead, and I'll do my best to answer.
First of all, thanks. It's a lovely presentation, but I do have a question regarding preprints. My question is that if we are going to follow preprints, so will our publication will be considered, or it will be published online, or it's just you can say a pre template of our publication accessible to everyone, or we can post it later to any publication journal as well, international journal. So yeah,
that's a really important question, and I'm actually just about to answer it here. I have a little comment up here. You must check with your target publisher to ensure that they allow you to post a preprint. Okay, so if you've got your paper ready to go and you're considering going for a preprint server, if you check, you can actually check on Sherpa Romeo. We'll put the link with the slides, and there are rules. Now, believe it or not, there's been a change. It used to be that posting on a preprint was a double submission and was not allowed. But because things have changed over recent years, probably with COVID was a catalyst here, many publishers will allow you to will accept the fact that you've put up a preprint and will allow you to go ahead, submit for peer review and get printed in their journal. But you absolutely must check. If you have a target journal in mind, you must check the rules around preprints, or indeed you could be barring yourself from getting published. So thank you for the question. It is absolutely hugely important, because remembering what your preprint is pre-peer review, pre-branding. And if you just allow me to read through the points here, I've just got a little note down here that the preprint will have its separate DOI, digital object identifier. So no matter what, when you submit for publication, it will have a very specific DOI attached to that publisher. But the preprint exists as a preprint, as a different version, but as a preprint with its own DOI. Okay, so that's very, very important. So things to think about. Not everything is accepted at preprint. There is always some level of quality control, and that could be very basic editing to make sure that everything makes sense and that there's a reasonable level of logic and assumptions, and not too many not poor quality assumptions, not poor science, as much as possible. It will be given its own DOI, which will be different from any peer-reviewed journal version. Not every preprint will go on to be published, as I've mentioned, and I've explained why that can happen. It will have its DOI, remember that. So even if you put something out there and that doesn't go on to be printed in a journal, it is discoverable and can be cited. So do make sure that even if the results are preliminary and you've made that clear, that it's a very well put together, in other words, grammar, facts and figures, the maths, all of those things stack up, and at least there is at the editorial level quality and a quality document. Ensure that material is accurate at point of publication and the writing is of the highest standard you can manage. And just remember that for those of you who are if you use Google Scholar to search, you'll often notice that there are multiple versions of a document. It'll tell you the number of versions. One of those versions could indeed be the preprint. So always make sure that you're looking at the latest document. The other thing with that is, of course, as well, to make sure that you use the cross mark on the PDF to make sure that you're looking at the most up to date and that the paper hasn't been retracted. Okay, a little bit about practitioner research. So blogs are still a thing. So you can share your practitioner research. Blogs are citable on other digital platforms, through professional bodies or voluntary organizations, through trade magazines, depending on what your profession is, and through popular newspapers and magazines. So in Ireland, we have a great service hosted by our national broadcaster, RTE, called Brainstorm. And we encourage all of our researchers and practitioners, all of our employees, basically anything to add that the public may find interesting. We ask them to make it available, to submit it to something called Brainstorm, which is then advertised on the RTE platform and made available to the general public. So lots of ways. One of the ways we know that we're dealing with practitioner research is there is frequently applied, the word applied appears in the title. So just something to keep in mind, particularly good if you're just getting started with publishing. If you're actually quite nervous or you're not really sure whether you're ready to engage with the peer review process, practitioner research can be a really nice way of getting some feedback from like-minded professionals who are working in the area, who will give constructive feedback but help you get over that first publication. So very good option to go for. So worth knowing, how can you tell if peer review is very important to you? How do you know if a journal is peer reviewed? They will usually tell you. Peer review in terms of scholarly or academic publications is a selling mark, and they're usually very keen to let you know that the journal or material is going to be peer reviewed. So for print, for those of you, I'm not sure that many of you actually go and go to the library shelves and take a print journal down and have a look at it. But if you are, you'll notice on the reverse of the title cover, they will tell you all about the peer review process or the editorial board, one or the other. If you're looking online, it will be in the About section, the aims and scope, perhaps the submission details, the guide for authors or instructions for authors. One of those will tell you all you need to know about the peer review process. So peer review, there's lots of different types. There's, I suppose at the very entry level, there's an editor, and most publications will have an editor. In fact, I'd say probably all have an editor, no matter what you're doing. We need to make sure that we can make sense of the publication. We have the peer review process, which can be a single process, a single blind, which means that generally the author doesn't know who the reviewer is. A double blind, which means that the reviewer and neither the reviewer or the author know who the other is. We have open, where everybody knows who they are. And we have collaborative, where there may be one or more reviewers and it's more of a conversation in terms of it. Now, I have to say that thanks to peer review, or thanks to preprint, blind peer reviewing is actually quite different. So, sorry, that's just my little picture for collaborative. So in some instances, because of the rise of preprints, a blind peer review of any kind, single or double, is actually quite difficult. But however, that's not new either. In very small specialist communities, that was also quite difficult to maintain because the community is so small, people recognize writing styles, or if you're submitting, you could be so specialist that there are only a handful of people that would be qualified for review. But Even so, the journal will tell you which one they opt for. So this is hugely important, okay, because you invest a huge amount of energy and emotion into producing your material, and you feel hugely personal, and you will be getting a review. If you've submitted for peer review, or indeed if there's an open platform, you are going to get some review, and you need to learn how to deal with that. And the first thing I'd say to you is, if you've submitted to a peer review and they've sent you feedback and they want you to address some issues, it's brilliant, because it means that if you address the issues to their satisfaction, they're going to publish you. Okay, so you might feel, oh gosh, this is terrible, but it isn't. It is actually brilliant, because it is a step on the process to really being, high quality, high evidence, quality mark publication. So a couple of things to think about. Try to avoid reacting to your first impression, because it will be an emotional reaction. You'll be feeling quite taken aback and feel like it's a personal attack. It isn't. This is an evidence-based review. The reviewers know nothing about you. They are dealing with the piece of information that you've supplied, and they need some clarity around a few points. So immediately take the person out of that, take yourself out of it. Take a reflective approach to writing your responses. And by reflection, for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of reflective practice or reflective writing, it requires us to take a multi-draft. So we write our first thoughts and we set it aside, and we come back and look at it again. And what that helps us do is, again, it helps us remove personal feelings and emotions out of it and become more focused on the evidence. In other words, addressing the question. So you might have written a lot, but you get to review your draft response again, but by saying, well, they've asked me to look at this specific thing. Does my initial response address that? So it helps you to take a much more evidenced, focused view of doing that, of responding to it. Go through your feedback and address each point separately. Don't try and create a narrative. Look at the point and address that before moving on. If there are separate reviewers, they will have given you each one. Address each reviewer separately. Don't try and give one back, because your reviewers, if there are 2 or 3, they may have picked different things, number one, but they also might slightly disagree. They might have slightly different points of view. So always address your reviewers separately and taking a point at a time. Avoid giving your opinion. Again, they've given you points, address and either agree or disagree only on the points that they have given. If you don't agree with what they've said, you need to make sure that you've made a point to say, yes, you accept their review, but this is what you meant, or this is what you meant, and clarify. If you get a query or a comment and you really don't understand it, discuss with a supervisor or a colleague, and you can always ask for clarity from the reviewers. Okay, but if you're not sure, clarify before responding. So when you're trying to decide on a publication, look at what you like to read first. What articles have impressed you in terms of their clarity and how they're laid out? What do your colleagues like to read? What articles are shared with you? What do people say, oh, you might be interested in this? What are the journals? Where do they come from? And what's popular in your discipline? So this is where we're trying to target a publisher, in addition to all the points of, funding stipulations or institutional policies, or who you want to research or who you want to reach in terms of your audience. Start trying to target a publication. You can do that in 2 ways. You can do old-fashioned keyword searches, which are very handy, or indeed some journal selectors. So a keyword search can be identifying an area of interest and looking at key themes. In other words, what your writing is going to be about, and deciding whether it's specific or general. Think about the databases that cover your area. So Web of Science and Scopus are going to be 2 of the main abstracts and indexers in the social sciences and the sciences. So could you use keywords to search those databases and have a look and see where those topics pop up? The list of journals will be available on the database, and see if one of those journals might be interested to you. You can also look at a subject specialist database, like the Education Index, or ERIC, which would be Educational Resources, or IEEE database, or indeed a specific publisher database, if that's what you're interested in, like Taylor and Francis or Emerald. They all have databases. So you can do a keyword search there. The other option is a manuscript matcher. I've got a couple here, but I can tell you that most publishers will have one. And basically you can enter, as you can see here, we're looking at the IEEE one down here. You enter keywords, or you can actually cut and paste an abstract into some of them, and they will give you a list of journals that would be interested within their field. So obviously this is by publisher. JSTOR is a bit broader. They will make suggestions on journals that publish in your area. Okay, so that's really handy. I've got some more of them there. As I said, these slides will be available to you. But I think if there is a publisher that's not on the list, if you're interested, you could go and have a look on their website and look for Journal Matcher, and you might be surprised. I would say you'll probably find one there. So I can't speak about publishing without talking about predatory publishing. So we have this very probably quite famous picture here of a wolf, not in sheep's clothing, but covered by a journal. And this is from a quite well-known article in Nature about predatory publishing. And it was actually called No Definition, No Defense. But as this is Nature we're talking about here, they did actually go on to give us in that article a pretty good definition of predatory publishing. And you can see it here. Publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship, and you can read that there. And you can see that they don't have good practices in terms of their editorial practices. But I actually think this is a good way of seeing it. There are publishers that exploit our need to publish. As academics, as researchers, you are required to get your publications out there. There's no point in doing your research in a darkened room with the door closed. You've got to publish. Okay, you've got to share that information. So unfortunately, there are publishers out there who are going to piggyback on that need and abuse it to make money. So that's what predatory publishing basically is. And every time we think we've identified all of the methods of being a predatory publisher, we have more problems. So types of predatory publishing. We have vanity publishing. That's the paying to get published, mostly associated with book publishing. But it does happen. And I know there's a specific example of it. If any of you are, and hopefully some of you will go on to produce, say, a PhD thesis, which will go on your institution repository and be open access. And there are certain unscrupulous publishers that now will contact you as soon as they have, as soon as that's available, and say, oh, we've seen your work. We'd love to publish your material. If you pay us X number of pounds, we will give you a book. We'll publish the book. So what you basically get for your trouble is a bound version of your PhD thesis, which they will sell, but you will, if possible, but you will never get any money for it. If they do manage to sell it, they will be getting it free. So that's kind of vanity publishing. We have phishing, which probably many of you have experienced already. You receive an email telling you how wonderful you are, how great your contribution is, and how really interested these people are in publishing your work. And they will do it for a very small fee. So we call that phishing. We also have hijacked journals. So these are journals online where people have basically cloned the site. They've taken all of the details, even the standard number for the journal, but they're not actually the journal. They've hijacked the website, and you will send in your work, which will disappear into the black hole. You will pay, and it will never appear anywhere. We have impersonators who are produced journal titles which are almost familiar to you. They sound very familiar, but they might have added a word like encyclopedia, or they might have taken away a word, And again, the same idea, they're looking for a relatively small amount of money to publish your work, which will probably not be cited, will have very poor standards of editorial process. Really, you don't want to publish with an impersonator. You'll disappear. We've Trojan horses. These are publishers that produce absolutely fantastic websites, but when you look at them, there's no archive, there's no background content, the links are dead. Basically, there's nothing on the inside. And then we have unicorns that look too good to be true, literally. They make all sorts of promises and deliver on none of them. Then we have poor publishing practices. Okay, so coerced citations, and this could come about, and I have heard it happening, that you submit your journal, or your article to the journal, you get your peer review back, and they say, this would be great if you should consider adding this person. Now, sometimes this reference might be valid. It might be something that would lend weight to your argument, but sometimes it doesn't. And they're kind of insisting that you put in the citation. So it's not good practice. An editorial board that doesn't exist. A peer review process that doesn't exist. That's also a fast peer review process. So you submit on Monday, and on Tuesday or Wednesday morning, your peer review is done and dusted, and you're ready to go, usually without correction. So either of those things are very poor practice. Encouraging you to advocate for a company or a product in your writing. Obviously very poor practice. Putting a fake impact factor. Impact factors can be important depending on, again, why you wanted to publish. And sometimes people think that that's an enticement to get people to publish with them. So basically they make them up. They have hidden charges. So they haven't been upfront about the charges, or indeed they've told you the charges, but the charges are so small. And then maybe they add some charges on as you're going through the process. I've heard of both of those things. I've heard of upfront charges for producing what would essentially be an AI generated content based on your own CV, or small charges that get bigger for whatever reason when you submit. And this one is actually quite dangerous, because an archive, if you submit your work, you need it to be around for a long time, as long as possible, forever. And sometimes these journals don't have an archive. Just a couple of myths about predatory publishing. It's very easy to think that all open access, because as Aisling is going to explain how all of this works to you, that open access is the same as predatory, because there's a charge. That is not true. They're absolutely not linked. Predatory publishers have, in a way, tried to exploit the model of open access. That's all, but they're not. One does not follow the other. Predatory journals are not only published in particular countries. That would be lovely. We could just say all of the journals coming from this country must be predatory. That is not true. They're everywhere. They're across the board in every country. Anybody who has figured out how to make money through publishing, predatory publishing, across the world. So not just in one specific place. Just because it doesn't have an impact factor doesn't mean it's predatory. Impact factors are quite difficult to come by. So there's about 2,000 journals published every year, or 2,000 journals try to get to Scopus. Many of you will be familiar with Scopus. They take about 12-13% of those actually get indexed and will begin to build their impact factor and be indexed in that. But they only accept a small amount. So it's 2 years before you can actually go to have your journal indexed again. So if something is new, it may not be predatory. It just may be too new to have an impact factor or be indexed by the big indexers like Scopus of Web of Science. There is no list, single list that lists all predatory journals. We have some ways of detecting them, but lists are dangerous things. There are a couple of them out there, but people get into trouble for saying things specifically are predatory. So it also would be impossible to keep updating the list. So we have some things that can help you, and of course we're here to help you to identify predatory publishers. Open access journals, as I've said, are not preprints. Open access journals will have gone through editorial peer review processes. They are not preprints or preprint service, even though the material on preprints is free to access. So the only way to really spot predatory publishing is through due diligence. So I'm not going to run through this. These are on the slides. There are different ways that you can identify a risk, and this is quite an interesting way. It does high risk through low risk. So that is one way of identifying. Conferences, it's worth mentioning that conferences are possibly as prolific, maybe not quite as prolific as predatory journals. So they can be quite difficult to spot as well. One of the rules of thumb about predatory conferences is if it costs you more money to present than it does to attend the conference, that's probably not a good thing to be a part of. Another way of looking at that is just to run over summarize that resource. If you're contacted by an unsolicited email, generally the better journals don't have to go looking for content. People want to publish with them. If it's new, that's a totally different thing. But you need to be careful about unsolicited emails. Misleading titles looks like something that you know, but has a word that's in the difference. The title's not indexed in any major databases, including the DOAJ. Remember though as well, if something is new, that may not be enough of a criteria, but it's a good hint. There's no impact factor. I've already explained that, or there's a fake one. No peer review. Fees are well hidden. Or there's a relatively low submission cost. Again, Aisling will talk to you about how much an APC costs and how much these are charged. She will mention both and you'll see the disparity there. As well, interesting, APCs, which Aisling will talk about, are usually required at acceptance, not on submission. There's no details or not enough detail on ethics and integrity, nothing about plagiarism, conflicts of interest, or how indeed resolutions to disputes would be made, particularly around authors. And also, you could lose copyright. Again, Aisling's going to talk to you about that. And they might have a lot of new titles in the 1 year. So these are all kind of red flags. If you're contacted by one, there's these websites, Think, Check, Submit. For conferences, there's Think, Check, and Attend. But there's also your local librarian or librarians. Myself and Aisling would be delighted to take queries from people if they're nervous about predatory publishing or predatory publishers, and we would always discuss. We have a great team here and we discuss it. Sometimes go wider afield and reach out to colleagues and networks, obviously not divulging your name, but certainly would put the name of the publication out there to get feedback. So it is in all of our interests to avoid predatory publishers and predatory publishing practices, and we are all united and are really happy to help with any of those things. Just briefly, if you discover, because this is actually something for people who are maybe published and well known, suddenly deciding or discovering that you've been appointed to review an article as a guest editor, or that your photograph or details have been put up on the website all without your consent, your choices are ignore it or contact the publisher and say, please remove them, and remove them as soon as possible, which I would advise. I'm going to hand it over to Aisling. Just before I do, because Aisling is going to kick off with a lovely example of what a phishing email looks like. It's really good and it's a nice way of us to hand it over. But I would just say that predatory publishing is quite important to us because all of our reputations are at stake, and the reputation of scientific research is at stake. We've got to make sure that we maintain standards. Your work may not get cited because reputation will go ahead and people will realize that this journal is not the greatest thing to publish in. You're losing your copyright, your ability to share your work freely on your institutional repository. Poor science feeds into fake news. We don't want that. Proper peer review is low quality research. Okay. So without that, I think I am, oh, and of course, value for money. We're all paying for this. Aisling's going to talk more about value for money. So I think I'm going to hand over to Aisling, as I said, who is going to start with that really nice a piece about
Thank you very much, Roisin.